Yeah. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this panel. The CRA challenge: can open source and IoT stay agile under regulation? We are going to complement some of the discussions that we have had during the morning around the CRA, as you all know, and I have the pleasure of having with me on stage Hackbarth from Bosch Digital Solutions, Harald Fischer from Balena, and Dirk-WIllem Gulik, from the Apache Software Foundation. So basically, we are exploring with manufacturers, open source foundations, how open source, manufacturers, IoT, and the CRA will work all together. So my first question to Kai is, Kai, you are manufacturer, consumer of open source, contributor. So how did Bosch get prepared for the CRA compliance?
I mean, I cannot speak for the entire group, but I mean, generally, I mean, what I've seen, for example, we have, quality management procedures. So they have been revised, with, I would say, aspects that are coming from the CRA, right? So basically, if you want to get what we call Quality Gate 4, which means, this is like a product that can be, sold to end customers, certain, aspects like, you need to be able to perform software updates and so on, right? So this is, something that I have seen, that we have done. Then there's obviously generally a lot of education happening around this because everybody, is in one way or another affected, right? So I mean, these are, I would say, the two main, things that I have seen, to call it like this, right? And I mean, obviously, we do so many different products at Bosch, right? So there is obviously also a lot of variation, so it's different in mobility, different industrial, different in building, for example, right? So, but yeah.
Harald, from your perspective, how do you see risk assessment processes and why it's so important for CRA compliance?
Yes, so we as a manufacturer see that risk assessment processes are completely giving us freedom to decide what to do and what not to do. In Europe, we have always this risk-based approach for conformity assessment of products. Without it, we wouldn't be able to basically have free decisions on what we build in a product. For example, the risk surface of an operating system, what we build, or the risk surface of a Bluetooth toothbrush is completely different. And you have to design those products in the same process, but with different implementation details. And this only can be based on a risk understanding, where we are currently in trying to understand the risk surface. We basically inherit from the usage of open source projects. So we need to maybe assess even the risks of open source projects to understand if they are increasing our surface of attacks. And in the end, we understood that as a manufacturer, this is a non-scalable problem in risk assessing, and tooling around this is quite not existing, and we try to contribute there to build risk assessment tooling.
Thank you. You commented about the importance of open source, and Dirk-WIllem, maybe you are a good representative of the open source community to tell us a bit how the open source community is getting ready for CRA compliance.
Right. So I think the open source community, sort of like there are many sort of like different emotions going through the open source community. The first one is probably sort of like, finally, at last, someone taking security being taken seriously. Essentially, a piece of regulation, an act, the Cyber Resilience Act, making normal, mandating what we as open source, like in the Apache Software Foundation, have been doing like for the past like 25, 28 years. Essentially like doing good software release management, fixing your security holes, disclosing your security, having good release management and so on. So in a way that's one thing. Secondly, the other thing there is that the open source stewards, so essentially the open source upstream providers, have been given a special role in the CRA. We are not parties that place things onto the market. We're not parties that have to attest their software. Essentially, the burden of determining whether a piece of open source software is good enough to be included in the product you're placing on the market is not with us, but is downstream, sort of like with the party that places it on the market. So by and large, basically, in theory, the industry should not look at open source to solve this problem. It basically will have to assess on a case-by-case basis whether a particular piece of open source is well managed enough, is in a state that it basically can be included in your product, given its intended use, and so on and so on. However, we know essentially that open source, we're not a different world. We are in fact the industry. I mean, 90% of whatever you ship is typically open source. The people who write that open source are typically part of that industry. So what we do expect to happen is that just like we've seen in previous efforts in the past, is that we simply sort of get a whole range of extra things we will be doing as an open source community. So people like engineers working at downstream companies will simply sort of come together and work in the open source setting, in the open source repository, on everything they need for their own attestation, or everything they need for their own assessments, or everything for their own due diligence. So we'll probably sort of see next to release notes, we'll see other documents to sort of support this process. And yeah, so essentially sort of I'm actually sort of quite optimistic for this to sort of really sort of make things better.
So you commented about many of the challenges that we have ahead of us. So if you need to rank them or select which are the ones that should be faced first by the industry, which ones do you think they should be first addressed?
So I think there are some very sort of operational practical challenges, like creating those S-bombs, actually starting to understand what you have in the product you're shipping. Because today, when you're shipping something like some embedded device or whatever else, quite typically it came with hundreds, if not thousands, of snippets of open source code and libraries and things like that, hidden sort of in that SDK you got or whatever else. So actually sort of breaking that down, looking into that, using the so-called S-bombs actually to understand what you have is, I think, sort of the very practical thing. I think the more serious challenge is that as an industry, we sort of have to look at these things a bit differently. We're used to sort of taking all sorts of random crap from all over the world, package it up, ship it in our product, and then putting a nice big disclaimer on it saying oh, if it breaks, you get to keep the pieces. We're not responsible for that. Well, that is basically coming to an end. So actually making that realization that all of a sudden as a software vendor, you're just as responsible for the product you make as, let's say, the manufacturer of that chair there. If that chair now collapses while you sit on it, it definitely is a problem for the manufacturer. So with software, basically, we're going to get the same. So actually, I think that's sort of going to be the real challenge. I do expect, like all other engineering fields which had the same thing, like whether they were steam engines exploding or whatever else, that essentially sort of groups of engineers will come together and collectively solve this. And I'm sort of expecting that open source will probably be the place where these things get solved. So at the Apache Software Foundation, for example, where we already have these well-managed release processes, I am expecting sort of a whole influx of people working for companies that place products in the market which are under the CRA to actually collectively work on getting that essentially ship shape, because it's silly that every company does that on their own. It's basically much cheaper for everyone to just send half an engineer there for a few days a week to actually sort of do it collectively, then rather than spend tens of engineers on that problem.
And do you want to complement?
No.
Okay. Thank you, Dirk-WIllem. Do you see, or Kai, Harald, do you think that these challenges, this extra burden that the regulation is putting on us, it's something that could impact the innovation potential or the innovation pace that we have with our products?
I mean, it definitely has an impact. I wouldn't necessarily call it that it will hinder innovation or anything, but for example, so I, let's say, have this OSGI-based embedded middleware, right? So this is also used in various Bosch products, and I recently had a discussion with the industrial boiler colleagues, right? And there's a similar, let's say, legislation in the UK to CRA, right? And they basically asked me, can you guarantee to us that you support this specific version for the next 9 years, and you provide security patches, right? So, I mean, I did, let's say, commit to it, right? But honestly speaking, I mean, that's an issue, right? And I think these are still, things we need to discuss how we can ensure it, right? So in this specific case, I said, if I'm not able to, let's say, commit to it, I give you the source code, right? But I mean, generally speaking, right? So we need, as an industry, and that's true for. I mean, I had a lot of discussions also in the context of software-defined vehicle, right? So or autonomous cars, where you have a lot of code in the car. Let's say the development of new software AI models and so on is I mean, growing fastly, to call it like this, right? So the entire, let's say, development or the way we develop software, we need to rethink, I think, right? So, so that's sort of what I see happening so far.
You want to comment directly?
Yeah, Derek, comment.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah. So one of the things we've seen historically, like in industries that had this problem, is that actually sort of like open source changes the equation a bit, because essentially means you've got access to the source code. So what in the Apache Software Foundation we've seen quite regularly, is that players in the industry suddenly realize they need to keep a certain piece of code alive for 10 years, 20 years, because it's in that banking system or that radar system, whatever else. And they simply decide to, well, let's just do it together. Let's simply sort of like send a few of our engineers to that open source foundation and simply maintain that piece of code. That way we can sort of like all make our commercial promises and don't have to have complex upstream contracts or anything else. We are basically sort of like in control. So they are solvable problems, but they're still hard problems.
I mean, if the community works, yes, absolutely.
We see it a bit different, I would say. We don't see that manufacturers that collaborate in the open source by just creating. In our case, we built Linux on Yocto tooling. Like a manufacturer creates a Yocto layer, we can build a new device type and support a new evolution for a new product a customer wants to build. Like we are now on the edge of physical AI. We need like software from yesterday on devices that run tomorrow. And I see that the CRA will basically hinder people creating the ability to ship something very, very soon in after the hardware is existing, to the burden of, am I a manufacturer now? Do I have to support this for 10 years? Can I even do I have a sustainable business to maintain this for 10 years? And if they can't, we at Balena cannot take the responsibility for it. We don't develop drivers or kernel modules. We are more like an integrator of everything that is existing on the hardware market. But the customers are expecting that we take this responsibility in the end, and there's no good answer for me. For us, like there's no clear path of what's the legal sound discontinuation of a product and of software. Like who is taking the responsibility when Balena has to discontinue a full hardware because the maintainer is not doing the software anymore? 3 years in the product, are we liable for it? Of not giving the software anymore? Like our software is already open source all the time. This is not helping our customers.
So maybe to add to this, sorry, but I think, I mean, the one point that I mean, that we didn't talk about, right? So I mean, how to do it is one thing, right? But the thing is, it's going to cost money, right? And I mean, how do you price this into your, let's say, product, right? I mean, if you do this for like 1-2 years, right, you can do this for like 10 years. that's it's a pretty challenge, right? So, and I had discussions about software updates in media speakers, right? So 80 cents per year, a solution for 80 cents per year was too expensive for them, right? So I mean, just to have a baseline where we are, right? So.
Yeah, no, I mean, this is expensive. I mean, and there are certain business models which essentially CRA and next year the PLD will essentially not prohibit, but will make very unattractive. On the other hand, I mean, you also see positive things. So, for example, one of the BSD foundations, for example, provide, for example, full attestation on their entire software stack, everything included in it. And then you suddenly sort of see that actually sort of like the type of numbers, the sort of cost you're talking about is not in the hundreds of thousands of dollars. It's sort of like in the tens of thousands of dollars. So suddenly these become sort of like manageable numbers. I mean, still not cheap, but yes, I mean, these options are there. So you can easily sort of like imagine a similar thing happening, for example, let's say Apache projects, a group of companies decided they really sort of like want to do attestation around that as an extra thing. And yeah, then you suddenly are talking very manageable numbers to pull that off.
Yeah, I'm circle back on the positive outcomes. Do you envision positive outcomes out of the CRA? In which direction is it going to be better relationship between manufacturers and open source projects and foundations? How do you see it?
So I think open source, definitely will play a major role, right? I don't think we have yet the answers to how we're gonna make this work in practice, right? But I'm pretty sure we'll find a way to work, right? The thing is, right? So, like I said, for our case with this boilers, right? So I mean, typically our, let's say, IoT stack, right? We have in the terms and conditions, we have a 3 years support and maintenance that is basically, that we provide. After that, we do not maintain it anymore, the specific version, right? And I mean, there I do see the point that Harald brought up, right? So I mean, you probably will, how to call it, not develop newer versions because you will have basically a nightmare of maintaining all these different versions, right? So, and I mean, I think there are a lot of things, where we really need to figure out, how we evolve, I mean, the stack, their improvement, their new features, their dependencies that we need to take care of, and so on, right? And I think, like I said, right. So there's how we build software for our devices, we need to basically rethink, right?
I would say we do have two sides of being having a positive effect. So I believe that there will be a positive effect of being capable of understanding security issues in software in all our products that we don't know today. I believe that this will come. This is not just a lawsuit after lawsuit and nothing changes, because there are enough good manufacturers that want to take the responsibility and build more secure products. Now they basically have also some kind of an argument to their leadership that they have to do it now, what they may have wanted for the last 10 years already. On the negative side, I think that open source has to merge more, projects will die, because a barely maintained project will not survive. That's maybe a bad thing for ambitious engineers or developers that just wanted to code for fun, and it grew bigger than they expected. And then they won't be able to maintain it to the level the industry needs it.
Yeah, so essentially, in the open source world, in the Apache Software Foundation, we've learned how to keep projects well managed, controlled, alive for decades essentially, and do security well, do releases well, and things like that. So I think in many ways, sort of like I see a lot of positive outcomes. This is that those sort of practices are sort of like now forced upon the entire industry. That will end up sort of like a few years into CRA with much better package managers, much better dependency management. I love the fact that the reporting of security issues you find, reporting them upwards to, for example, the Apache Software Foundation is sort of like now mandatory. So there's basically there's sort of like is a lot of like positive, a lot of positive things. On the downside, I sort of like agree. Like some projects will die. In the Apache Software Foundation, we got something called the ethic. If you as a project are badly maintained, you've got security holes and you're not fixing them, then after a few months or after some time, you get sort of like moved into the ethic and you're essentially sort of like killed. So yes, it does sort of like mean that there will be some roadkill. There will be some sort of like evolution, so to say, on like which project survives, which projects don't survive. The other positive outcome I'm expecting is that companies downstream will get much more aware of where their software is coming from, where that 90% of the stack is coming from. And that's actually important, because the reason why I personally think that open source is so dominant and why it always wins is because it's often written by the people that actually use it. It's not dreamt up by some marketer, it's not dreamt up by some product manager to fill a niche. No, it's actually written by people that use it. So the more information you get as an open source project from your actual users, the people who actually use it, the better your open source gets and the more it gets winning. So I'm very much expecting the CRA to sort of like re-strengthen that feedback loop, because I think in the last sort of like decades, or in the last decade, we've sort of like lost a little bit that feedback loop to sort of like all sorts of other essentially sort of like funded processes. And now sort of like repairing that, sort of like having companies more downstream, sort of like more involved, more aware of the open source they're using, more incentivized to send fixes upstream, more incentivized to have their engineers become part of that open source ecosystem, I think is essentially going to increase security and quality a lot.
So we reached the top of the hour. So for closing, just a final statement from each of you.
Yeah, I mean, what can I say as a final statement? I think, legislation in general, will be a challenge in the coming years, right? Be it the CRA, AI Act, or whatever you name it, right? And I think one of the biggest challenges, not the CRA itself, right, is because CRA is, for Europe, right? You have something for UK, you probably have something for the US and the other countries, right? And I think we have to see how these things, develop and how they are maybe in conflict with each other, right? Because I mean, that's, I think, then the real challenge for us as a, machine vendor or a software vendor, right? So.
We as a manufacturer want to build more secure products so that our goal is always reduce the friction for our users, and this is also then after 2027 being compliant based on very secure software stack that we have that we want to take responsibility for, and I'm looking forward to this being able to provide to customers.
So first of all, don't sit back and expect the market or open source to solve this problem for you. This is a manufacturer's problem, not the open source problem. Secondly, that's also your solution. Come and sort of like join that open source, send your engineers there, send your engineers to the Open Regulatory Working Group to essentially sort of like collectively make that fix, because doing it together is a lot cheaper than each and everyone having to basically do it for thousands of packages on their own. So software is great, you can copy it endlessly, but it also means you can collaborate and sort of like actually do these things together. So don't expect others to fix it for you. Don't expect money to be able to fix this to you. The thing that is going to fix this is actually actual engineers working on it. And if you want to do it efficiently, I would say do it at the open source foundations, because then you don't have to do all of it yourself.
All right, there we go.
Good. So thank you very much, Kai, Harald, Dirk-WIllem, and all of you for attending. We are closing here, but of course happy to catch up after outside. So thank you all.
Thank you.